So in this video, I'll explain how to arrive at the solution of getting the mastermind game to work. So in the morning, I explained the first part of the assignment, which was creating a successful a single iteration of the game mastermind. So I go through this part rather quickly because I think all of you already got there. So this is, I cleaned up the code a bit, and this is what we specified in this morning. First, we specified the game settings, which were basically the colors, the number of colors, and the maximum turns. And then after we set up the general game settings, we generated the answer, so the randomly generated color sequence, and we asked for the user input by using this input prompt function. And then we worked, when we had these two variables, the user input and the answer, we could work with those two variables to provide the user with feedback. That is either the number of correct locations and correct colors, or only correct colors but incorrect location. Well, we discussed this extensively in the morning, so I'll skip through that. Then we could provide all this information in a nice feedback table, providing you with this nice overview of all the feedback. And then eventually we could determine whether the input specified by the user is either the winning sequence or actually is the wrong sequence and the user is game over. So that was all done in the morning. But now we want to extend the game such that we can run multiple iterations, because that's the idea, right? So the user keeps on specifying input, and on each iteration receives feedback. And at the moment the correct sequence is guessed, we let them know, no, we stop the game, let the user know they won the game. Or when they reach the maximum number of iterations, we have to let the user know that they are game over, and we stop the game too. So I already specified here the general idea of the while loop. So while this is true, we prompt the user for input, and then we do the following ideas: getting the feedback tables, decide whether to break out of the loop, and then provide the user with feedback. And actually all of this is already specified in the line of code you used here before. Additionally, we want to put this in a function because then we can change the general setting of the games outside the function. So instead of playing this game always with 6 colors, when we build a general function, we can also play a game with only 5 colors available, or where the user has to input specified 3 colors instead of 4 colors, etc. So how do you deal with this? Let's start with opening a new function file. And let's give it a correct name. And let's call our mastermind function just mastermind. Save it with the same variable name. I already had made it, but let's redo this all over. Yes, and then I typically, let's remove the default settings here, and we need to fill up the space. And because, as I said, we basically already have all the core elements of the code we need in this main file, let's copy it and just paste it within the function. And let's add an extra tab here, so to be neatly organized. All right. So let's think about the input of mastermind. And that's actually specified in these lines of code, right? The available colors, the number of colors that the user needs specified, and the maximum number of turns allowed. this is something we don't want to have within the function because we want to be able to change those parameter setting outside the functions. So let's instead use those variables as the input of our function. Oh, and colors, max turns. Correct. Okay, since we have specified it now as the input, we can remove it from these lines from our function. Okay. All right, and then we got to the answer and user input, and the rest of the code. So as I said before, we want to keep on doing this. So all of these lines of code represent one iteration, but we want to keep on doing this up to the point the game is over. So let's put all of this in a while loop. Yes. So normally we need to specify, or always you need to specify an input to the while loop, but I will ignore it for now. And for now, focusing on the line of code within this loop. So ask and get input of the user. Yes, that's something we want to do for each iteration, right? The user needs to specify its input for each iteration again. The next line says generate answer. Hey, but this is something we want to get outside the while loop, because if we would keep it in here, the answer will change its value every iteration. That will make the game quite impossible to solve. So we want to get that outside the while loop. Oops. Oh, the other way around. So I now specified the answer outside the while loop, and that makes the variable unchanged. You could call this a static variable. All right, so then we ask every iteration the user input, and with those two variables, the static answer variable and the dynamically changing user input variable, we can do our feedback computations. The nice thing is we don't have to change anything about these lines of code. The logic remains the same. All good, so this is perhaps better named compute feedback. And then this is provide feedback. So the next step was that we provided the user with feedback, right? So this we already did in our main script, but then I told you can ignore the first two inputs and just give the first two inputs these two variables. But now let's look into those two first inputs. What do they mean? So therefore we go to the feedback table, which I provided you with. Let's open it and look in the function what those two variables mean. Let's start with the first one. I turn, well, as specified here, the number of turns of the game. So this feedback table needs as an input the number of iteration we are at the moment. So the first time that's 1, the second time 2, etc. So how are we going to specify that in our function? Well, basically we have to set some form of a counter, right? But yeah, this counter is yet unspecified, but we know already that the first time this counter should be 1, right? And the counter is increasing each iteration with 1. So let's define that here. Update counter. So then we do counter was counter 1 plus 1. So we saw this before, right? In many of the for loop structures or the while loop structures, we did this before, adding a counter. It tells me still that counter might be used before it's defined. So I didn't define it yet. Well, of course, before we start the game, the counter is 0. So this should look familiar to you now, building such a counter within a while loop. All right, so now we fixed the first input of the feedback table. Let's have a look at the second input, which is called pref _fb, colors chosen by the user in the previous turn. So yeah, what is crucial to mastermind is that the user tries to figure out, based on its previous indications of the color sequences and the feedback it received, what eventually the answer is going to be. So it should have access to the history of the color sequences that he or she provided as an input. So only providing the user with the feedback, this is what you currently specified as input, is not useful. So how can we do that? Well, the logic is basically, so we only have two colors chosen by the user in the previous turn. And the logic is a bit the same as the counter. So the feedback table here always get a renewed value. But the value before that is the previous value of the previous iteration of the feedback. So you should see this as before we arrive in this line 30, feedback table has a value that equals the previous specified input. And then we run line 30 with our new iteration, and then we update the feedback table to an extra row indicating what the current feedback is. And then again, we do the same for the next iteration. This is how the feedback table is getting updated row by row and is increasing its size. So it's a bit the same as the counter, but instead of always iterating and adding +1, in this case, we provide the feedback table with the information of the previous round. So in this case, we still have an error. And why is that? Well, again, as we had with the counter, we didn't define it yet. So that we have to do outside the while loop. And what's the value of the feedback before we start the game? Well, that's just an empty vector. All right. Then we are almost there. After specifying the feedback table, we want to determine whether we have to quit the game or continue to the next iteration. So when do we quit the game? Well, in the case that the user won, that's what we specified in line 32. You don't have to change anything to that. So if the number of both correct location and color is equal to the length of the answer, so imagine there will be 4 different color in the answers, then if and both would be full 4-2, then we display winner, so let the user know that they won. Display if you want, the answer of the sequence. And then we want to break out of the while loop, and that we can specify with break. Now we have to change a little bit in line 37, because if we use the same logic that we want to break out the while loop if the user is game over, it will always do that when we only specify else, because probably the first iteration the user didn't specify the correct color sequence yet, and then this will be not true, and it will always end up here and ends the game. And we only want to end it when it reaches the maximum number of iterations possible. So instead of else, we can use else if and provide a new comparison here. And what we could provide here is else if the counter, that's quite useful, or iterator that keeps track of how many iterations we had. equals max turns. Where's max turns coming from? Well, there was our previous specified input of the function, and that was something we specified as the builder of the game. This is the maximum number of turns the gamer can use. So if this is true, it will display game over, and we will break out the while loop. So where are these error messages coming from? Well, that's basically because I didn't finish up writing my while loop, so it doesn't know to which function those break statements belong. And normally you specify here in comparison. So while something is true, I want to go in there in the while loop and then keep on running up to the moment this statement becomes false. So the strategy I use now to build this while loop, and there are many other versions you could have, but this was the first solution that came up in my mind, is that the first round, I always want to get into this while loop, right? And you can specify that with while one, which is a kind of, how would you say, it's a way to indicate, okay, you don't have to do any comparison. I just always want to keep on doing this while loop. I only want to stop this while loop when I specify break. So that's done now. So let's save this now. Oh, yeah, we didn't have output arguments, but we don't need those output arguments because all this function is doing is displaying feedback to the user in the comment window. So those two output arguments in this case are not needed, and we can just remove them and only specify function inputs. So let's go to our main. So all of this I'm going to remove now because this is what we just specified in function. I keep our game settings, and now I'm going to call mastermind. Specifies input. Max turns. And I'm going to run this, and of course we hope it's going to work, but maybe for educative reasons it would be nice if I run into an error. Let's see. So I'm clearing all closals, so let's run this. Okay, this is the first iteration. Let's specify some input. I'll just simply do 1, 2, 3, 4, specifying yellow, red, blue, green, and enter. Okay, it's still working. I get some feedback. So I have 1 in the correct location, 2 correct colors, but in the incorrect location. Let's assume yellow is correct. I use a new color, and red and blue are in the other locations. All right, and I get the same feedback. So, okay, let's just do very quickly this game without thinking too much. Hey, I won. So that was very lucky. So this is working. It even provides me with the sequence I should have guessed. And indeed, that's the one I guessed. So the function is working as it should be. Yeah, that was all I wanted to say about the solution of the mastermind game.